1941, the Daimler Works, Radford, Coventry. A four-wheeled machine rolls out of the factory gates and onto the bomb-cratered streets of a city that the Luftwaffe tried to erase 5 months earlier. It is small, barely taller than the men walking beside it. A low turret sits on a compact hull wrapped in thin steel plate, 14mm at the front, 10 on the sides. 4 road wheels on independent suspension. A long-barreled 2-pounder gun points forward from the turret, the same weapon fitted to British light tanks. The whole thing weighs 7.5 tons, less than half the weight of a Panzer III. It looked elegant. It looked delicate. It looked like something that had no business carrying a tank gun into a battlefield, where German armour ruled the desert and the hedgerows and every road from Tripoli to Caen. Officers who inspected the first production models questioned whether something this small, this lightly armoured, could survive a single engagement against anything heavier than a motorcycle patrol. Some called it a toy, some called it a death trap. It would go on to fight from Alamein to Hamburg, from the beaches of Salerno to the canals of Venice, from the D-Day shoreline to the Danish border. It would serve in British armoured car regiments for nearly 2 decades after the war. It would equip armies in India, Sri Lanka, and the Middle East for over 70 years, and it could do something no other armoured car in the world could do. It could reverse at 50 miles per hour, the same speed it drove forward, with a second driver at the rear who could take the wheel and flee an ambush without ever turning around. Its designation was the Daimler Armoured Car, and it was the finest reconnaissance vehicle Britain ever built. To understand why the Daimler existed, you need to understand the problem Britain faced in 1939. The army had almost no modern armoured cars. The old Rolls-Royces were museum pieces. The few Guy armoured cars in service mounted the wrong gun. When war broke out in the Western Desert, British cavalry regiments were forced to rely on the South African Marmon-Herrington, a vehicle built on a commercial Ford truck chassis, with a boy's anti-tank rifle for armament and 12mm of armour. Crews hated it so much they ripped off its turrets and bolted on captured German and Italian guns in desperation. The Birmingham Small Arms Company had already solved a related problem. In 1938, BSA submitted a prototype scout car to the War Office, and after 16,000 kilometres of testing, it won the contract. That vehicle became the Daimler Dingo, one of the most successful scout cars of the war. Engineers at BSA immediately recognised the Dingo's potential as something larger. By August 1939, they began scaling up the Dingo chassis to carry the turret from the Tetrarch light tank, armed with a 40mm 2-pounder gun. 2 prototypes were completed by the end of that year. The chief engineer overseeing the project was L.H. Pomeroy, who had served as Daimler's chief engineer since 1929. The transition was not seamless. The armoured car weighed nearly twice as much as the Dingo, and the extra mass nearly destroyed the transmission during early trials. 4-wheel steering, which worked brilliantly on the tiny Dingo, proved dangerously unstable at the armoured car's higher speeds and was abandoned entirely. But the delays allowed the engineers to solve a problem that would accidentally place the Daimler 15 years ahead of the civilian motor industry. The vehicle itself was a masterpiece of practical engineering. At its heart sat the Daimler Model 27 straight-six petrol engine, displacing just over 4,000 cubic centimetres and producing 95 brake horsepower. Mounted at the rear, it drove all 4 wheels through a Wilson pre-selector epicyclic gearbox, mated to a Daimler fluid flywheel. This gave the car 5 forward gears and 5 reverse gears, with a separate transfer box allowing the driver to select direction independently of gear selection. The result was a vehicle that could reach its full 50 miles per hour in both directions, forward and backward, without hesitation. The fluid flywheel eliminated the need for a conventional clutch pedal entirely. Gear changes were smooth, nearly silent, and could be pre-selected before they were needed. For a reconnaissance vehicle creeping toward enemy positions in the dark, this silence was not a luxury, it was survival. Each wheel received power through its own prop shaft in an H-drive layout, with epicyclic reduction gearing in the wheel hubs that gave the Daimler a climbing gradient of 1 in 2. And because that hub reduction gear physically left no room for conventional drum brakes, Daimler fitted Girling hydraulic disc brakes on all 4 wheels. This was a world first for a production vehicle. Jaguar would not race disc brakes until Le Mans in 1953. Citroën would not fit them to a road car until 1955. The Daimler had them in 1941, born not from ambition, but from necessity. A second steering wheel and throttle were fitted at the left rear of the fighting compartment, with a vision slot in the rear hull plate. The commander could take direct control and drive the vehicle backwards out of an ambush at full speed. No rival armoured car on any side of the war could match this capability. The main armament, the 2-pounder, carried 52 rounds and was paired with a coaxial 7.92mm Besa machine gun with 2,700 rounds. The 2-pounder could penetrate the armour of every Axis reconnaissance vehicle and most light tanks at combat ranges, Some vehicles later received the Littlejohn squeeze-bore adapter on the barrel, which dramatically increased muzzle velocity and allowed penetration of up to 80mm of armour at 500 metres using tungsten rounds, enough to threaten the flanks of German medium tanks. Between 1941 and 1945, the Coventry factory produced 2,694 Daimler Armoured Cars in two principal marques. The Mark II, entering service around 1943, featured improved engine cooling, a more rounded gun mantlet, and a better driver's escape hatch. Now, before we get into where this vehicle actually fought, if you are enjoying this deep dive into British wartime engineering, hit subscribe. It takes a second, costs nothing, and helps the channel grow. The Daimler first saw significant combat in the Western Desert in mid-1942. Units including the 1st King's Dragoon Guards, the 1st Royal Dragoons, and the 11th Hussars began receiving them as replacements for the hated Marmon-Herringtons. The relief among crews was immediate. As one military historian noted, it was the first time in the Desert War that a British armoured car outclassed its German counterpart in firepower, armour and cross-country performance. The Royals fielded 46 armoured cars, including Daimlers, at the Second Battle of El Alamein in October 1942. The 12th Royal Lancers received Daimlers from March 1943 and became the first British troops to link up with American forces in Tunisia the following month. In the desert, armoured car regiments operated observation lines stretching over 50 miles, with Sabre troops positioned up to 30 miles ahead of the main army. Vast, lonely patrols across open sand carried out by pairs of Daimlers and Dingos. Italy was poor armoured car country, close terrain of vineyards, olive groves and mountain passes. Yet the Daimler served there from the Salerno landings in September 1943 to the final advance in spring 1945. The King's Dragoon Guards became the first Allied unit to enter Naples. The 12th Royal Lancers fought dismounted as infantry at Cassino, then remounted their Daimlers for the breakthrough to the Gothic Line, becoming the first Allied troops to enter Venice. The most detailed combat records come from northwest Europe. C Squadron of the Inns of Court Regiment was the only armoured car unit to land on D-Day, hitting Juno Beach with the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division. Their orders were to race inland and blow bridges over the Orne. The cost was immediate. Lieutenant Shaw's Daimler was struck by an 88mm round. The driver was killed. Shaw lost a leg and died at the beach aid post. During Operation Bluecoat in late July 1944, a patrol from the 2nd Household Cavalry Regiment achieved one of the campaign's most consequential reconnaissance coups. Corporal Staples discovered an undefended bridge over the Soulouve River, sitting in a gap between two German formations, each assuming the other was guarding it. The 2nd Household Cavalry held the bridge for 2 hours until tanks arrived, enabling the 11th Armoured Division's breakout southward. The crossing was renamed Bull Bridge after the division's black bull insignia. At Christmas 1944, Sergeant Luke of D Squadron, 11th Hussars, held the ruined village of Gebrook with 3 armoured cars and 2 scout cars. At 5:45 on Christmas morning, every armoured car engine had frozen solid in the bitter cold. Fighting became hand-to-hand before artillery support allowed withdrawal. In the final weeks of the war, the Royal Dragoons captured a German general near Lübeck, took 10,000 prisoners, freed 16,000 Allied prisoners of war, and drove through Denmark to liberate Copenhagen. The 11th Hussars led the 7th Armoured Division into Hamburg on May 3rd, 1945, 5 days before the war in Europe ended. On paper, the German Puma looked superior. It was an 11.5-ton, 8-wheeled machine with a 50mm gun, up to 30mm of hull armour, and a range of nearly 1,000 kilometres from its Tatra diesel engine. In practice, it was a rare beast. Only 101 Pumas were ever built. The Daimler's advantages were stealth, compactness, quieter operation, and sheer availability. 27 Daimlers for every Puma that existed. The American M8 Greyhound was produced in far greater numbers, over 8,500, with a 37mm gun roughly comparable to the 2-pounder, but British units that tested it found it surprisingly roadbound in mud, difficult to reverse, and dangerously vulnerable thanks to its open-topped turret and paper-thin floor armour. The Daimler offered a closed turret, disc brakes, independent suspension, and the ability to flee backwards at full speed. For European conditions, there was no contest. The Daimler outlasted its intended replacement, the Coventry Armoured Car, which was judged inferior after only 220 of a planned 1,700 were built. The Daimler consequently remained in British service until the Alvis Saladin entered production in 1958. Abroad, the career stretched far longer. India's 63rd Cavalry was raised on Daimlers, and used them at altitudes above 14,000 feet during the 1962 Sino-Indian War. Sri Lanka kept them in service through the Civil War until the late 1990s. Qatar reportedly still operated Daimler Armoured Cars as late as 2012. Of the 2,694 produced, approximately 41 survive today. Examples sit at the Tank Museum in Bovington, the Imperial War Museum at Duxford, and the Coventry Transport Museum. Several remain in running condition in private hands. 1941. The Daimler Works, Radford, Coventry. A small, elegant, lightly armoured car rolls out of a factory in a bombed city, carrying a tank gun on 4 wheels and a transmission that belonged to the future. It was underpowered for its weight. Its armour would not stop anything heavier than rifle-caliber fire at close range. Its 2-pounder could not fire a high-explosive round. It arrived in the desert months later than the army needed it, and yet it worked. It worked in the sand dunes of Libya, in the mountain passes of Italy, in the flooded fields of Normandy, in the frozen villages of Holland, and on the roads into Hamburg. It worked because every feature, the fluid flywheel, the disc brakes, the 5 reverse gears, the rear driving position, served a single tactical purpose: observe, report, survive, disengage, fight only when cornered. The Daimler Armoured Car was not the most powerful. It was not the most heavily armed. It was not the most produced. It was the most perfectly matched to the doctrine it was built to serve. And it outlived every vehicle designed to replace it. That is not luck. That is British engineering.